And talking about what policies
we don't
have
want to see
worked,
that.
wasn't there some progress with the six-party talks?
Well, I mean, there was. There was a communique, a declaration that basically laid out the parameters in which a deal would be signed, a sort of roadmap, if you like. It was pretty vague. But the thing that the elephant in the room here is that why is Pyongyang developing its nuclear deterrent? It's not because Kim Jong-un or his father or his grandfather was mad, as the US media says. It's because they think it's in their strategic interest. And why is it in their strategic interest? Because they are surrounded by people who do not like them. They do not have security guarantees from the end of the Korean War. It's an armistice, not a peace. And all these things were meant to be coming out of the six-party talks. You were going to have security guarantees for the DPRK in return for a denuclearization. At the time, it wasn't even a nuclear state, to stop testing, and that slowly reduce tensions. On the current path, what we're seeing is essentially an arms race in Asia, where you have a deployment of missile defense in South Korea. The Japanese want Aegis-based land systems to be able to take out missiles that are fired over its territory. They have both threatened to go nuclear if the nuclear umbrella doesn't work with the US. So the real answer is not more war, it's jaw. I mean, it literally has to be diplomacy. And the Chinese have a plan on the table, as you know, freeze for freeze, if you please, as the, and that has been firmly rejected by Washington. So it's very, very interesting. There is a way out, but it's going to require a lot of commitments.
Ray, so I'm wondering, why can't that happen again? Why can't there be some kind of promise, some kind of non-aggression pact, backed perhaps by a United Nations Security Council resolution, saying that North Korea, the DPRK, would not be attacked?
Well, it's all conceivable. I don't think anybody would believe it. I think deep down, Kim Jong-un and his father and grandfather before them, they know that the United States and all the neighboring countries want them gone. They want regime change. I mean, they don't
look at
want...
Libya, look at,
Yeah, and so they're like, oh, do I want to be like Gaddafi? Do I want to be like Mubarak
but
or anybody else?
Predominantly because of the nuclear ambitions. I think if the nuclear ambitions didn't exist, they're obviously very, I mean, it's got to be the worst human rights conditions in the planet right now.
But the US track record of regime change is not that good.
We would change that.
But
you give them up.
If you look at the Iran nuclear agreement, does that not leave Pyongyang saying, why should we trust any further offers of deals? Why should we take the Americans' word for it?
That puts a big
as soon as they have an election, they're going to
Or the invasion of Iraq, or the toppling of Gaddafi, or
David, what does this mean for the region? Because there has been something of a response from South Korea. They fired missiles into the water, and as James Mattis said, this shows us that there's going to be some kind of response. That's one thing. Japan, they've held an emergency cabinet meeting, but what does it mean for the region?
I think China is key to all of this, and I think it means the world is looking to Beijing to turn the economic screws. Without China and the trade and oil and so on, North Korea is really struggling. But Japan and South Korea, their options are very limited. I mean, as your guest mentions, in the longer term, there is the potential for a nuclear arms race. But in the meantime, they're under the American umbrella, really, depending on Washington to deliver some kind of solution. And in the meantime, it's a very anxious and unsatisfactory situation of sitting put. If you're in Japan, sort of watching missiles drop nearby, and sort of feeling that your hands are tied.
It's going to be a tough neighborhood then. Nathan, talking about a role for China, there was that proposal which China came up with months ago, by the foreign minister, who said that China's proposal is that it persuade the DPRK to stop its nuclear testing, but the United States would have to stop its joint military exercises with South Korea. And the United States said, well, we can't do that. This is a treaty ally. That's not going to be happening.
Yeah, the freeze for freeze. And we went into that before, and there was actually some discussion in Washington and the Pentagon about perhaps moving the exercises to Alaska, for example. You don't have to do them on the Korean Peninsula. You can war game elsewhere. But it was felt in Washington that that would be a signal to allies already worried about US commitments to its allies around the world, that wasn't the case. Even if Seoul, for example, went along with it, it may send a signal to other allies, especially Japan. So there is that. There is also a feeling in the Trump administration among certain economic and foreign policy advisors who are not pro-Beijing, that they're being played by China, that they are being played on the North Korean issue, and that China will never fully abandon the DPRK for its own strategic reasons, but also for reasons of the past. If you put an oil embargo on someone, remember what happened with Japan in 1941. They tend to lash out a little bit. So there is this feeling going forward, so that perhaps China has played the US. The big problem is that you're going to need China. So there needs to be some sort of commitment. And, you know, China has indicated it's willing to work with the US so long as it commits to certain things. They're called the 3 no's. No US troops north of the 38th parallel, no regime change, no collapse of the North Korean state as well. If the US commits to that, then they can maybe have discussions. But Beijing is worried that any discussions about a post-Kim Jong-un or a post-nuclear Korea could be a signal for some sort of accommodation or regime change. So the trust is not high.
All right, Michael, what kind of sentiment is there in the US administration, the Trump administration right now, for some kind of serious cooperation, getting together with Beijing, with China, to look at this problem?
I think, you know, from the very beginning, and certainly from the head of state meeting in Florida, that there's been an absolute commitment to that, and there has been some progress. The vote in the UN, where China joined the United States in these deep sanctions, was, I think, a product of diplomatic progress with China. And it's also, I think, in fairness, not all diplomacy. It's, I think, a growing recognition in Beijing that this threat is now not 3 or 5 years off. It's potentially 3 or 5 months off, and that's inevitably going to change your perspective on things if you're sitting in Beijing's position, because I do not believe that they want a nuclearized North Korea. On the other hand, you know, they do continue to trade with North Korea. They've opposed the oil embargo. They've opposed other measures. For instance, it would, you know, allow us to intervene against North Korean seacraft and whatnot. There's a number of steps that haven't been taken, and one of the reasons I think there was skepticism about China originally is that the trade with North Korea over the last decade has expanded exponentially. Now it's coming back down, but those numbers were very discouraging. It didn't show that they were exerting the level of diplomatic pressure that I think was conventionally sort of understood and expected. But I do believe that they're committed to it now. This has got to be concerning if you're there in China right now. And I feel that hopefully it'll, you know, bring Washington and Beijing closer in trying to find a solution to this. Hopefully a diplomatic one.
All right, we have a few minutes left.
I don't see any of those 3 positions. Yeah. I don't see any of those 3 positions that Simon mentioned that are deal breakers for this administration. I don't think there's any intention to move beyond the 30th parallel or to change regimes. The military testing would be, the ending our military preparations would be.
I have got about 2 minutes left. I want to get to the second subject, which is taxes in the United States, tax reform here in the United States. Very quickly, Nathan, what are the issues on the table right now?
Who gets the most money? And when Trump campaigned, he said that he was going to give a big tax cut to everyone, including blue-collar workers in the states he won, that made him president: Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania. It was only about 100,000 votes he won. And it looks like, according to the Congressional Budget Office that scores these things, that everyone who voted for him in these districts will get a tax increase, whereas actually corporations will get a tax deduction, as will high net worth individuals. Now, we haven't seen Donald Trump's tax returns, but apparently someone did some numbers on 2005 and said he would probably pay a rate of around 3%. Now, this is what's out there in the US media. So this could be a very divisive thing. Even if it passes, it could come back to haunt him. Right,
Ray, the big picture here, when you look at tax reform, is that the guys with all the money are going to get tax cuts, and the people who are in the middle class are not going to get tax cuts.
That's what all the analyses say right now. I mean, we don't know what the shape of the bill is yet. The Senate bill's not done. They're tweaking it now. They had a meeting on Capitol Hill today. The senators met, and some people are going to get things they want. And as always happens with a big tax bill, there's going to be this big jumble. And then, if it gets through the Senate, it goes to conference. And you get into a conference committee between House and Senate negotiators, you don't know what's going to come out of that. There's always some fascinating story about a provision here and there to help somebody. But so far, the analyses show that people in the middle class, after a 10-year period, are going to pay more. And this thing is going to add about $1.4 trillion to the debt over the course of 10 years.
Michael, that debt, $1.4 million being added there, I mean, all very well tax cuts, but how are they going to make up that loss?
With growth, because you've got a number of things in this tax bill that are hugely stimulating to the United States economy. The first thing is we have $4 trillion ballpark that's sitting offshore because American companies have been unable to bring that money, repatriate it back to the U.S. under a lower tax basis. That $4 trillion should come back. Cutting the corporate rate from 30, right now we have the highest corporate rate in the world, in the industrialized world at least. We're not competing on a tax basis with major trading partners. We're going to be able to with that. I think that's what's fueling the market. That's what's fueled over 1 million jobs created since President took office on January 20th.
Okay.
And so the growth itself is the key. And frankly, we need to restructure this debate because the debt and deficit are not things that people embrace or that we're enthusiastic about.
Okay.
But our crisis is predominantly one of growth and job creation.
All right, I want to get David in very quickly. I've got 30 seconds left.
It's trickle-down economics all over again, and possibly with the same results as last time.
It's not, though.
One moment, Michael.
Also at test here is Donald Trump's ability to twist arms in Congress, which he failed miserably to do with healthcare.
All right, David, tell me very quickly, in 10 seconds, if this bill is not passed, there's all kinds of talk about the government being shut down. What does that mean?
Yeah, well, I mean,
the US government closes down?
That's part of the headache, as we've seen before in the US. If there's not agreement by the end of the year, they have to
very quickly,
Democrats
you want to say something?
We've heard this argument about growth, dynamic scoring, that you cut taxes and increase. We're at 4.3% unemployment. The economy is doing great, really. I don't know how that happens. It hasn't happened in the past. I'd love to see it happen. I don't think it will.
And we are going to have to leave it there, gentlemen. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.